of 2017. In the 6 months before the Charlottesville conflagration, there were a whole bunch of pretty high-profile racist attacks in this country. And even though that was only a couple of years ago, most of them have already been forgotten. But the day after the Charlottesville attack happened here on the show, we ran down some of them just in the 6 months before Charlottesville. I mean, in February of that year, in Kansas, 2 Indian engineers were shot in a bar by a guy who screamed racial and religious epithets at them. One of those 2 engineers was killed, the other was wounded, as was a bystander. The following month, March of that year, Midtown Manhattan, a young white guy from Maryland drives all the way from Maryland to New York City with a sword so he can randomly stab to death a black man on the street who he didn't know from Adam. He thought doing it in New York, in Times Square in New York City, would get him the most attention because he was hoping to set off more random killings of black men in America with his totally unprovoked sidewalk murder. Just weeks later, it was Portland, Oregon. 2 girls on a commuter train subjected to a torrent of racial and religious abuse and violent threats by a guy on the train, threatening them, screaming at them. Passers-by on the train intervened, put themselves between the attacker and these girls he was going after. 2 of those passers-by were killed. Another one seriously wounded. That same week, this young man, who had just been commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the U.S. Army, 3 days away from his college graduation, was stabbed to death in Maryland by a young white student who was a member of a hardcore right-wing racist online group. That was all right in the lead up to Charlottesville, Virginia. In the last couple of days, the New York Times did a big list of about a dozen white supremacist attacks that have happened in this country over the past 6 or 7 years. I was looking at that list today, actually. None of the events that I just described that happened in the 6 months before Charlottesville even made this list from the New York Times, for whatever reason. I mean, I'm not faulting the Times for that. I'm just saying there's been a lot of them in recent years, kind of even hard to track, even just over the last couple of years. And to the extent that this is not random stuff, to the extent that these are not, bad apples, to the extent that this is the manifestation of an organized white nationalist movement in this country that seeks violence, that is deliberately trying to inspire and encourage and enable racially motivated and anti-Semitic attacks and any other kind of attack that would advance the cause of white nationalism or bring about their fabled race war. I mean, if you are worried that the federal government, that this federal government at this time may not be inclined to do enough about that they may treat all of these things as if they're individual crimes, all committed in isolation, just a few bad apples, nothing connecting them. If that is a realistic downside risk of having this president at the head of the federal government at this time, well then, aren't we back to a question that was first called a few decades ago? Can the victims of these crimes and their families play a part in shutting down this terrorist movement in a way that the federal government may not be able or willing to do? Can the victims do it? Can the victims and their families bankrupt these organizations and these organizing hubs, right? Is it possible, strategically, to organizationally decapitate these organizations and these hubs that facilitate this kind of terrorism in America? Can you organizationally decapitate them even when law enforcement will not? Hold that thought. Live question. Stay with us.
The revolution will be televised.
Exactly. Liberty Mutual customizes your car insurance.